Thank you so much, Shalila, and we will kick off what is another meeting of the EPAC here for the CVP. We have a good group of people assembled today, and I think we have a great plan. Hopefully, you'll think the same. But I wanted to welcome everybody and say that we really appreciate all the work and the back and forth we've had with you all over the last few weeks as we've kicked this process off. We have gotten to the point where we have one scenario locked down as much as we can from our side. The rest of the material for scenario one of the CGPP capacity expansion planning will be taken on by the NISO's modeling team. They have a couple of internal modeling efforts ongoing regarding how to model external areas and a few things on how the load flexibility assumption is actually going to be implemented in the dispatch model. But for our purposes, scenario one has been locked down now for the last couple weeks. Where that leaves us today is kicking off kind of the future of the EPAC trying to come together to create two additional scenarios, scenarios 2 and scenarios 3 of the CGPP capacity expansion planning. We have some materials that we've developed over the last month or so, some of which have already been emailed to you. We do hope to be creating a new section of the EPAC website that's just going to be kind of a repository of those materials so that you don't have to keep scrolling through your emails and keep track of those. That will have updated. That should be within the next week or so. We should have a bunch of spreadsheets and PDFs up there for folks to look at. So sorry that's not ready for today's meeting, but that will be happening in the next few days. The purpose of this meeting, I really wanted to kind of come together and take a step back a little bit to really review the matrix we'll be using, which we created with the help of the NISO over the last few years through their system and resource outlook process that identifies kind of the key assumptions that go into creating a capacity expansion scenario. I felt like we raced a lot over the first few meetings, just trying to get people up to speed with some of the big assumptions, the key work products that have gone into these last few months of work getting ready to create these scenarios. But I wanted to take kind of a deep breath and walk through that matrix using scenario one details that are in the matrix now as the example, so that by the end of this meeting, everyone has a really good sense of what all those assumptions are that need to be generated in order to create a scenarios 2 and 3, and having a really good idea of what scenario 1 was, so that we can make a really educated decision on how we want to generate 2 additional scenarios for the capacity expansion planning. And remember, we'll go through this in a second through the timeline, but these capacity expansion scenarios, they are the scenarios that are going to feed through for the entire rest of the CGPP2. So we got to keep that in mind as well as we talk over these next few meetings. When we're generating new assumptions and new scenarios, we really want this to be 3 possible worlds that we're generating that all relate to each other somehow, so that we are providing, by the end of this, the utilities and the commission, the best available set of scenarios that allow us to determine and analyze these possible worlds to determine what type of transmission and distribution upgrades are really going to give us the most bang for our buck as we try to go for a zero carbon electricity system. So that was just kind of the high level overview of kind of where we are and where we're going. And we had a request after we sent out the agenda last time to kind of take that step back to go even farther and kind of bring up the timeline for the broader CGPP, so that we can all get on the same page in terms of timing and what the next steps are and how this does flow through the rest of the CGPP. And I thought that was a pretty good idea. So I think I'm going to try to share my screen, bring up that revised calendar that the utilities have put together over the last couple weeks, so that we can all look at it. We can walk through it briefly, answer any questions that folks might have about that timeline before we jump into the full meat of the meeting, which is walking through that assumptions matrix. Before I do that, and while I'm trying to share my video, were there any initial questions or concerns as we jump into the meeting? All right. So can folks see my screen now?
Yes.
All right, excellent.
Skylar, we can see the screen, but is it possible to zoom in a little bit more?
Probably.
Thank you.
I'm sure.
If
I'm
at all
sure it is
possible.
probably. I'm sure it's probably possible.
And also, I should note, I think you should be, as viewers, able to zoom in on your individual screens as well, so you can adjust it.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
And thank you, Jalila.
I just hope my computer doesn't explode in the next few minutes. Okay. So this is the revised calendar for this first cycle of the CGPP. This is the new version. This was revised based off of the new information that came out of the August 17th order. We have previously sent, I think, this around, but there was also another one floating around that was the original timeline from the utility filing. And you'll notice if you have both of those, you will notice that some of the dates are off between the two because we have kind of the new calendar basically shifts forward in time a few months based on the actual timing and reality of when that order came out. So with this cycle, we basically have it starting on January 1st of next year, which is when the official stage one capacity expansion modeling actually kicks off. For our purposes, we are kind of one of the inputs of stage one for the CGPP modeling. And so that's kind of what's in this blue bar starting back in October 1st, which I think we started even earlier than that. But the blue box here is just showing that until January 1st, and maybe we'll be able to sneak another meeting into January if we need it. But between now and January, we'll be working together to generate the list of assumptions that make up scenario 2 and 3 to go along with this scenario 1 that's already done. And we'll be able to deliver all of those things to the New York ISO to kick off their capacity expansion planning process. And that kicks off on January 1st. As you'll see right here, we have the CGPP cycle stage 1, all the scenario modeling, the guessing, the checking, the testing of the modeling, and the actual generation of results. That's going all the way out through the first quarter and maybe even through the summer of next year. And we have a couple of things happening while those final results are coming in. There is a tech conference of the ATWG going through their 3 quote-unquote advanced technologies that are under review, viability, presentations from experts, and look at current markets and models and regulatory issues. That'll be happening sometime in the first quarter of next year. And that will help us kind of plan out how we integrate the ATWG information and working group into the later stages. That was something that was explicitly called out in the order, was to make sure that as we're determining future solutions for T&D infrastructure, we're also considering things like dynamic line ratings, power controls, and energy storage as options for the solution set for transmission and distribution infrastructure. While we're also doing that modeling in stage 1, you'll notice that there's an overlap here with stage 2. And that's because we can actually be working with the utilities on their network model development while the NISO is completing their capacity expansion modeling. We don't just have to have the utilities sit on their hands that whole time during stage 1. They can actually be generating their electrical representations and their modeling frameworks of their nodal representations of their systems, so that by the time we have locations and magnitudes of generation and different resources coming out of the capacity expansion modeling, by the time that actually happens, we're ready to drop it into the stage 2 network modeling. I think that's a really important part of this so that we can kind of be maximizing our efficiency in our timeline here. And you'll notice that trend continues throughout the rest of the process. There's kind of an overlap between the stages where as we're wrapping up one stage, the other teams that are part of the utilities or the NISO or DPS, we are working simultaneously, parallel pathing some things to make sure we're ready to jump into the next stage as soon as we have the information ready. And could I just ask someone maybe from DPS if there's any other folks from DPS on? I can't see raised hands or comments or questions now that I'm in a full screen. So if anybody could stop me when there are raised hands or comments, that would be great.
I think, Skylar, this is Jalila. I think I see a raised hand from Raya.
Great. All right, go ahead.
Although I can hold questions until the end of your presentation of the calendar.
Okay, yeah, sure. Let's do that, and then we'll go back through the list of questions once we're done. So
Great.
we've gotten to stage 3 then, where the local sorry, the local assessment of transmission and distribution needs and issues have been identified. While in that stage, if you go all the way down to other things that are happening at that same time frame, we have 2 different decision points and 2 different work streams that are also happening during that time. The first one here in the gold star at about the that says NYSERDA to evaluate potential bulk solutions. That wording is not exactly how I think we would word it. We're going to be adjusting that. This was kind of the utilities taking their best guess at how it would be framed. This was just referring to that segment of the order that says, if we come out of stage 1 capacity expansion modeling, and we've identified interfaces where zone to zone or between utility territory solutions can be relaxed to solve major issues on the transmission network, that might be a candidate for a bulk level solution beyond any one utility's local transmission and distribution system. And that would be something that we as an EPAC and the state and NYSERDA could identify as something that we might want to look into. And that would follow the more typical process that's happened in the past, where NYSERDA and DPS and a consultant could identify if there are solutions and cost-effective solutions that could actually go into solving that constraint that the modeling identified. So that's that's not guaranteed to happen, but that's something that could happen as we move forward if that's something that's identified in the stage 1 modeling. All the way at the bottom, there's also something in the order that requests that by June 1st of 2024, the JU file recommendations to shift this calendar that you're looking at now, which goes for 3, maybe even more than 3 years if you count the pre-work that we've done so far. We were asking the JU to file recommendations for condensing this calendar into potentially a 2-year cycle. As you're looking at it now, that's just something to keep in mind. If you have ideas of how that could happen, that could be interesting for us to hear and the utilities to think about, which they're already starting to think about now. Just what aspects of this calendar do we think could be faster or better next time? We've thought about it a little bit. The full year for year 3 to have the commission review the CGP report is pretty generous. We think that might have some flexibility. There's some aspects of the stage 1 work that we have done and that we will be doing that may be easier in later cycles if we have the same modeling team or the same modeling framework or a lot of the same assumptions. That could save a lot of time up front. So there's some potential flexibility there in the stage 1. The places that we've talked to the utilities about that might have less ability for flexibility is that stage 2 through 4, where there's just really no way or very limited ability to accelerate the ability to find and model transmission solutions. There's so many steps to that process that it's already kind of condensed to a point beyond, or at least to the maximum comfort level right now. So we're identifying other aspects of that, and then we'll be, if we need additional flexibility elsewhere, we'll have to raise that again as a solution, but that's kind of the current thinking. So now that we're kind of next summer, we're moving into stage 3, going through identifying those local transmission and distribution needs that have arisen throughout those first 2 stages, and we're moving to stage 4 by the beginning of 2025. That starts reviewing preferred solutions to any of those identified needs. So if we come up with a situation where there's a high level of curtailment or some issue on the local transmission and distribution system, we're going to have to identify what type of transmission upgrades are required, potentially what those costs are, and how long those solutions would take. That's what happens in stage 4. And by the time we get to stage 5, we now have, a preferred build out of renewable generation and other generation to hit the zero carbon targets that we have and the other renewable targets in the modeling. We've identified the needs, we've identified potential solutions. And so that's when we really go back in and do the least cost planning assessment with that whole system. We'll be doing another run of the capacity expansion model with those constraints added back in, as well as some production cost simulations to assess potential bulk solutions that may have been identified. So we're trying to come full circle here where we're kind of doing our stage 1 modeling, not really knowing what additional transmission and distribution issues it might be causing, identifying all of those things through stages 2 through 4, then coming back to this modeling to make sure we've kind of solved that without hurting our cost effectiveness or our renewable energy penetration that we forecasted, to make sure we're still hitting all the targets while maintaining a reliable system and avoiding any additional transmission issues. Once we've come to that point, we basically finished the CGPP cycle. We have a working system that meets the targets, that has identified any transmission issues and solutions that we need to make that work. And we'll be preparing that CGPP report for publication by January 1st of 2026. At that point, when the report is filed, it'll be basically under commission review to determine which upgrades are the most cost effective, which ones are most likely to succeed and support the rest of the targets that we have. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of things that could happen between now and January 1st, 2026. So that review time is going to be very, very important to determine, based on how the world has changed or how the renewable build out has accelerated, decelerated, stayed the same, what we really need to do to make sure we're choosing the best, most cost effective upgrades at that point. Once the review is done, at some point there will be an order that would precede any upgrades that actually happen. So there would be a commission action that says, okay, you provided these 3 scenarios and these 3 sets of potential build outs. 2 of your 4 project recommendations are the same in every scenario. They look like no-brainers. Let's do those 2. There might be an additional upgrade that's only in one scenario but not in the others. And one that looks so cost effective, it couldn't possibly hurt to do it now. Those types of things, those types of determinations that'll have to be made as part of that review process before a determination is made of what projects are actually moving forward. And then we kick off the second CGPP cycle. This is a continuous iterative planning process, and we fully expect the world to change a bit over those 3 years between now and when that commission order happens. So we do plan on taking up the same type of a timeline, maybe hopefully condensed based on the June 1st, 2024 filing the utilities will be making, but jumping right back in with the best, newest available information and doing this process all over again. So with that, I think I'm gonna pause and I'll turn it over to somebody else to tell me whose hands are raised in what order, so we can take kind of questions one at a time. I'm scrolling through people, and I see Raya's hand up at the top of my screen. So let's start there.
Okay, thank you so very much, and thank you for this very thorough review of this calendar. It was very, very helpful. I do have a few questions. So one thing that, the order was clear is that there needs to be meaningful opportunity for EPAC input. And I think, for the record, I don't think this body really had opportunities for meaningful input on the first set of scenarios. We just got them Friday for today's meeting. So the question is that how can we make sure these input input, EPAC input pieces are put into this calendar and reflected in the calendar? And in particular, how can you help us understand the process for the next 3 months so that we, at this crucial phase where we're going to be looking at scenarios 1 or 2 and how we can have a good process so we can have meaningful iteration on the assumptions and other things that are needed there. And I get this is a very high level calendar, but I'm looking at the, the one box for, the Q4, and it would be great to have more detail there and how we're going to be able to have meaningful input.
That is a great question. I definitely should have done that while I was walking through, as opposed to doing it afterward. But now that we have a great sense of what this calendar looked like, we can go back and say, okay, where's the EPAC really fit into all of this? Because that's kind of what's most relevant today. So the first and most obvious one is we are right now basically pre-stage 1 modeling kickoff. The order calls out specifically that the EPAC members should be helping us generate those 3 scenarios. So that's what these next, I think we have 4 additional meetings after today, maybe 5, before we have to lock down scenario 2 and 3 assumptions. So the end of this meeting and the following 4 to 5 meetings, that is where we're going to be having a lot of our most detailed interactions about building those scenarios that go into the stage 1. The order also calls out that it expects the EPAC members to be engaged through stage 1, because as anybody that's been involved with capacity expansion modeling knows that you don't hit run and then 5 minutes later have perfect results that you can just plug into the next phase. There's always something that needs to be cleaned up or needs to be adjusted, some amount of the modeling that needs to, additional attention. And so that's where we would be hoping that the EPAC members would be available to stay on during that stage 1 process to identify, how those results are coming out, if it's actually doing what we were hoping the scenario that we've generated would actually be doing, to make sure we've actually come up with the three scenarios we were hoping for, and that the model is pumping out the results that make sense. So we expect you to stay engaged through stage 1, although probably not on this, every 2 weeks. It would probably be more on an ad hoc basis where we hear a week or 2 ahead of time that results will be coming. We'll try to schedule a meeting. We'll try to send results out earlier so that we actually have time for the EPAC members to review them, and then come to a meeting where we'll probably bring the utilities and the NISO and all of us together to talk through the stage 1 modeling results as they come in. The future stages, the order also calls out that the EPAC would be involved in stage 5 as well, where we circle back around to the capacity expansion modeling again once we've put in those conceptual and fully developed bulk or local transmission distribution system solutions. That'll come back into stage 5. And the EPAC would be involved again because you all will have a really good sense of what scenarios were developed, what the inputs were, what the initial capacity expansion modeling results looked like, so that you can compare them to the stage 5 modeling results to make sure they still make sense and they've done what they're supposed to do. And then we would also, I think, explicitly called out in the order, I think, is a review of the stage 6 report. And so those are the 3 kind of key timeframes where it's like it's a no-brainer. We clearly want the EPAC pretty heavily involved in this process. So we could potentially generate another one of these that just kind of highlights the obvious places for input. But what the order also says is if the people leading the EPAC, which is basically all of us, if we think that it makes sense and will help in your review of stage 5 and stage 6, there can be either updates or additional meetings or ongoing interactions with the EPAC through stage 2, 3, and 4 as well, so that you're not kind of sitting around literally from July 2024 until July 2025 without having much interaction. I think that would be good anyway. Just to have those ongoing interactions. They probably don't have to be biweekly. They might be monthly or every couple months, just to stay up with what the local transmission and distribution evaluations are like. So you're better equipped to look back at stage 5 and how it compares to stage 1. So I would imagine, my preferred calendar for EPAC would be, these biweekly meetings at least until January, followed by the ad hoc, probably monthly meetings at that point all the way through stage 1, followed by additional ad hoc meetings, maybe monthly, maybe a little bit less throughout stage 2, 3, and 4, followed by, again, just much more integration in that stage 5 and 6, because that's where we're really getting into the nitty gritty of the finalizing of the modeling and the assumptions. So hopefully that answers your questions, but happy to clarify anything.
It does, and I'll yield the floor to others. It's just saying that it'll be really helpful, especially for through the end of this year. We have these meetings. It'd be great if it could be reflected on a broadened calendar too, so that we know exactly what we're going to be discussing when. We have lead time to look at information, and so we can meaningfully iterate on scenarios 2 and 3, because again, we were not given the opportunity to meaningfully iterate on scenario 1.
Absolutely.
But just looking for some, so I will, but thank you very much. That was very helpful, and I will yield the floor. Thank you.
Okay, so I saw Bill's hand, but then I also thought I saw that he may have dropped. Bill, are you here? Okay, then I'll go to the next one that I saw pop up, which is Radhika.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I have a question on the New York ISO work. So we have provided some feedback on the state scenario, and my understanding was that New York ISO was doing the modeling as we speak, the capacity expansion modeling, or are you saying that actually that work will only start in stage 1? Maybe just some clarification around that.
No, that's a good question. No, it's actually both. So for the state scenario, which is baked in as one of the in-process steps that the NISO is taking in the system and resource outlook, that modeling is underway. The model setup, the testing, all that type of stuff is happening right now for their 2 policy scenarios, and what their process calls the state scenario, which is our CGPP scenario 1. That's being kicked off as we speak. The scenario 2 and 3 that we're developing right now, that we'll be developing over the next 4 to 5 meetings, that should be happening. That'll be kicking off more of that January timeframe when we get into the full CGPP stage 1. So it's both. Sorry for that confusion.
Okay. And then the second question I have is on that bulk consideration. You mentioned that it can be zone to zone sensitivities to see if like increasing the interfaces across zones would provide benefits, and then utility territory to utility territory. So just want to confirm that, and maybe if there is more color on the second piece. And what I have in mind is like an example, an area where you may have utilities, 2 different utility service territories, but they are different, and they are like constraints impacting on both sides. And maybe a bulk solution is a better alternative for multiple constraints. So is this an example of when bulk will be considered or not?
It certainly sounds like something that would make sense for a bulk solution. We do have, I think in the order that it does say one preferred sensitivity would be to relax those constraints. I think that is going to be part of the stage 1 modeling, to relax some of the most binding constraints between zones and utility territories to check that exact thing. If it's not caught in stage 1, that's something that throughout stage 2 and 3, if we're getting results that show those types of binding constraints, and we know the transmission topology of the state, and it's clear that we have those basically matching interface constraints between 2 adjoining utilities, that's something we would want to review as well. So yes, that will be happening. Yeah, I just wanted to note to folks that I had only put about 10 to 15 minutes on the calendar to do this review, but I do want to make sure everyone feels comfortable with this before we move forward. So maybe a few more questions if there's more hands up. I can't see any more hands, so if folks have their hands up, please just speak up, or if Jalila, you can see the hands, please call on someone.
Skylar, this is
Yes,
Chi,
I see that
actually
she,
from Nexo.
go ahead.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So actually, I have some clarification questions, and Rodika actually asked a lot for me already. And I mean, as NISO, we are here to assist the DPS, NYSERDA, and JU to conduct the CJPP, and also we have the obligation to participate as a member of EPAC. So I want to mention that, as Rodika mentioned, NISO is currently conducting the system and resource outlook. So there are different concerns on the bulk level, and NISO will be running 3 scenarios. The first scenario is the state scenario. And this is how we ensure that, as the order stated, there's some consistency between the CJPP and NISO's bulk planning process. NISO will also run 2 other scenarios. And based on our timeline, we do expect that by the time it's Q1 next year, we will have a good idea of what the generation pockets may be and what are the constraining interfaces may be. So we feel that that would be, I think that's probably getting into what kind of information can help the EPAC member make the determination of what scenarios we should run. So as always, we coordinate and work with all the members. So I'll be happy to come back and provide that information if that works for Skylar. Then later on, as in the study process progress, NISO also have other roles that we will be assisting in the production cost simulation stage. So this updated timeline, I'm not sure I've seen it before, and it would be very helpful, Skylar, if you could provide this to all of us. And for all the EPAC members, NISO has a CJPP support project that we have to go through and identify the timeline and resources NISO need to support this project. So we are going to, on our side, kick off that part of the conversation. This timeline and your inputs will be very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Skylar.
Thanks. No, that was great. Yep. And I think we have added this to the EPAC website. If you go to that website, it's on the kind of middle under the resources. It's on the bottom left. It's the calendar timeline or something. I can't remember what it's titled right now, but this has been added to the website.
Much appreciated. Thank you. I have not checked out the website yet. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Thank you.
This is Radha Surya from Invenergy representing IPNI. I think Yachi has laid out the steps very well, but I think it will be very helpful for this group to have a process map on how all these timeline and the milestones that are indicated here flows through. The process map gives the it actually identifies the handshake between different parties. For example, I'm thinking about here the NYSERDA to evaluate the potential bug solutions, and then the JU is doing the production cost simulation, and I know NISO is running the CJPP. So I want to understand how this handshake is done, but having a process map that lays out those steps would be very helpful.
That's a good suggestion. Yeah, no, I totally understand. There are, different parties doing stage 1 versus stage 2, 3, and 4, and then 5 changes again, and then it comes back to writing the report. So yeah, that there will be a number of data handoffs and a number of different folks leading the different modeling efforts. So we can try to find a way to maybe represent that cleanly, and hopefully, so we'll take that back and see what we can do there.
Thank you very much, Sheila.
Skylar, this is Dave Rupert from Transource Energy. Got a question for you, kind of tying into what Raya was talking about. At what stage do concepts like low impedance line and systems designs, when would something like that be incorporated? At what stage?
I think on stage 3. Maybe if there's someone on from the utilities that could jump on to help me out with that one, but I believe that would be part of their local system assessment where they're in stage 2, they're building their network models and setting all this up. So it could be there, or when we actually are running the local assessments to identify any issues, it could be in stage 3 as well. Is there anyone from the utilities that wants to jump in with further information there?
I was anticipating that it would be on the bulk system that the ISO would be running to get a sense of how that impacts the system as you're looking at building out and trying to optimize a bulk system.
Yeah, let me take that back, Dave. I'm having trouble identifying someone on the line. Oh, Nick, you want to say something?
Yeah, that's Nick Colbert, PSEG Long Island. David, are you talking about the existing system or the modeling of solutions?
Modeling of solutions and how that might impact the whole system.
Yeah, so that's Schuler hit it on the head. My understanding is that will be captured within stage 3 of the CDPP.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick.
Sure.
Thank you. All right, are there any other hands up? I would like to move on to the matrix if possible, but we might have time for one more quick question if there's anything. Okay, and just back to Raya's point earlier about wanting a more detailed timeline of what we're actually going to be doing as the EPAC, especially in this near-term phase where we will be meeting bi-weekly. It would be really good to have a better sense of what you all need to review and what you want to be prepared for. I totally hear that, and we're in the process of developing that. I know we just were able to schedule all those meetings within the last few days out to the end of the year, and we did have an internal meeting with DPS folks just to try to forecast out, okay, what are the stages if we know we're building 2 more scenarios with all these assumptions, where do we have to be making the final decisions on all these assumptions, and how many meetings can we take on all those things? So just from a high level now, and we'll be sending out more of a detail after this meeting. Today, we wanted to walk through the timeline. We want to walk through the full assumptions matrix. While we're walking through the assumptions matrix, we're going to be covering some of the assumptions that are probably just going to stay the same no matter what. Those will become obvious once we're walking through them. Some that are typically, high, very typical assumptions that are changed in certain scenarios that lots of people usually do scenarios or sensitivities on. And then at the end of the meeting, we were going to request that based on everything we've heard today, all the review of the matrix, and any additional review of resources we're able to post within the next few days to the website, that folks actually take the time to maybe send us via email some assumptions that you think are the most important ones to test in new scenarios. Potentially even sending us a title for a scenario, like what theme are you thinking of for a new scenario that needs to be changed and tested against scenario 1. And so I'll go over that hopefully in more detail in the last 5 to 10 minutes of the meeting, but that's kind of the steps for this meeting where we're trying to get everybody comfortable, identify potential quote unquote open or unlocked assumptions, and then having over the next week or 2 receiving input from you all about your preferences for what type of scenarios should be run for scenarios 2 and 3. And then we will aggregate that as a staff team and bring that information to the October 30th meeting that's on the calendar. And I'm not sure if we've posted that or put the meeting invite out yet, but in that October 30th meeting is when we'll be putting potential scenarios on the table, merging ones that are basically the same, throwing some out that might not actually fit, full criteria or aren't close enough to other scenarios, to be as relevant, and then see if we can come to an agreement by the end of the October 30th meeting, the general themes that we're hoping to test for scenarios 2 and 3. Then we'll move into a couple meetings in November and at least 1 meeting in December, where we'll be actually nailing down the specifics about those other two scenarios. We might need to schedule another meeting in December or go into January for a meeting, but that's kind of the more detailed look about where the steps we're taking there. I think I saw a hand pop up, but then it disappears.
Hey, Skylar, this is Chi again.
Hi.
Just some clarification. So, like relaxing of the bulk interface, for example, I know there is interchange use of the word scenario and sensitivity. Or when you talk about the scenarios, do you mean the relaxing of specific interfaces or something else?
Something else. Thank you for the clarification. Yes, that's
Thank you.
very, very important in this modeling is the difference between a scenario and sensitivity. We want to be able to test broad scenarios that change some key assumptions, such as maybe cost of resources, availability of renewable resources, some really key fundamental scenarios to the capacity expansion model itself. That's helping the model make decisions. We want to change some of those key decision points in the model to see how it changes the results. And that's how we want to develop scenarios. There are some sensitivities that I think the order requests in all of these scenarios, and different aspects of the capacity expansion modeling, where a sensitivity, such as going into a scenario and in the modeling, relaxing a specific transmission constraint between zones and seeing how it changes the scenario's results by relaxing constraint. That would be a sensitivity, and we'll try to manage that amount. We don't have an infinite amount of modeling time or resources, so we have to manage the amount of sensitivities we're doing, but there are some key ones that we're particularly interested in. And Bill's back now, and I see he raised his hand. Welcome back, Bill.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yep.
Great. I'm sorry, I was having some audio problems with the with this. I'm traveling, but Skylar, two questions for you. One is stage 1 and stage 3, how they interact between the two of them. If we have a scenario that has a very high distributed energy resource component that would relieve some of the needs to build out distribution system, and we talked about this a little bit in the last meeting, it seems like that assessment occurs in stage 3. How do you envision those interplaying and being able to capture that value in the analysis of the capacity expansion model going forward?
That is a great question, because as you pointed out, I think in one of our last calls, the stage 1 capacity expansion modeling doesn't really go below that zonal level. So we're talking probably 230 kV in most of these interfaces between the zones, and so we're not seeing the unique interactions between DERs and the electrical system. We're only seeing them modifying the load or adding solar power to the grid. We're not really seeing how they impact the grid until we move to stage 2 and 3, where the utilities build their local network models and run an assessment of how the build out from stage 1 impacts their electricity system. I would expect in stage 3, and some of it might happen in stage 2 if they have kind of fixed or firm resources they're building into the model, but between stage 2 and 3, when the utilities are building out a system, if we have decided that a high DER scenario is worth exploring, we might, cite a lot more of that solar power on the distribution network. We might cite a lot more of the storage that's built in stage 1 on the distribution network, and have the utilities cite that those DERs on their local systems in stage 2 and 3 to see how it changes those local T&D flows and changes the solution set. So that's how I would expect it to go. I might end up being surprised, or there might be some wrinkles I'm not thinking about right now, but that's kind of my first reaction.
Okay, that makes sense to me. One thing it does bring up is that we have to be cognizant of the fact that value won't be reflected in the capacity expansion model. So we're going to have to actually probably force those scenarios or force those sensitivities in order to explore that dimension. And I'd encourage us to think a lot about that as we make these new scenarios.
Great point. Thank you. Okay, I think that was a great discussion on the process map and the broader aspects of the CGPP. I wish we had been able to do this in the first 2 meetings, and I definitely would have if my hair wasn't on fire that whole time, but we will now hopefully use this as our foundation, and I'm going to try to magic my way into sharing a different document. Bear with me for a second. Did it work? Right.
Yeah.
Looks like it's slowly coming up for folks. Okay, that's good. All right. Okay, let's see if I can make that full screen as well. Oh, that's weird. That's worse. Okay, I'm going to stay in this because I think it's larger than trying to go full screen. So the second part of this meeting, we wanted to walk through these assumptions that have been developed for the, it's either called the state scenario if you're reading the materials in the System and Resource Outlook, or CGPP Scenario 1 if you're a member of the EPAC. So we're trying to make sure folks realize that those two things are the same things when we say them. This is an assumption matrix. I think it's about 4 pages long. It's been sent out in various forms a couple times, and apologies that we weren't able to send the most updated version out until I think Thursday or Friday, unfortunately. But we wanted to walk through this with everybody so that you're very comfortable when you've had the chance to ask some questions about what the assumptions are, why they were chosen the way they were for scenario 1, so we know what ways we can change this when we change it to the scenario 2 matrix and scenario 3, so that we're all very comfortable with how these scenarios are developed. So as we move through here, the matrix is set up so that on the left side, you see that the name of the assumption that we're trying to develop, this first one is just generator descriptions. How are we actually going to talk about these things when we go through the assumptions and talk about the types of resources we're going to be building or retiring or building into the model as base case scenario generators. So we just have that set in here. This is basically the language that has been used this year in the NISO process. It's been changed since the last process to clarify that in this middle resource here, contracted resources, they're defined as those that have been awarded contracts. They've actually have signed contracts with the state and are incremental to any base case generators, which are actually firm fixed generators that are already incorporated into the NISO system according to the inclusion rules, which are typically set as resources that are currently generating or are at a certain advanced stage of construction. And then candidate generators are generators that are new generation sources that are available to the model to choose to build out to meet the energy needs that the capacity expansion model is seeing. So that's basically 3 types of generation. Base case generators that are just built into the model. Contracted generators, those are typically ones that are not built yet, but have signed contracts to build at a certain time frame. Typically, you would think of these as the NYSERDA contracted resources. And then the third type is just candidate generators. These are your wind, solar, offshore wind, energy storage, different resources that are available to the model to choose. I saw a hand come up, and this time it actually says the person's name, that Aaron.
Thanks, Kyler. Thank you. I understand the generator descriptions for the ISO's differentiation between the lower demand or, in their runs and then their contract scenario. I guess I have the wrong thing up. My question to you, though, is could you explain the relationship between these categories and the policy targets that are on the following page?
Yes. So the base case generators are resources that are basically already operating in the NISO. Some of those might be solar power, they might be wind. Those generators would count towards our policy targets, whereas, say, fossil fuel generators that might be base generators would not count towards, for example, the 2040 zero carbon target. contracted generators, I think in almost every case so far, those are renewable generators. There are some energy storage resources, I believe, that are built in as contracted resources. These are basically firm builds that we put into the model that have signed contracts. Those would count towards the policy targets. And then the model, since we have not yet hit those policy targets yet, we still need more resources to be built out in order to hit the targets. The model will be choosing from the candidate generators to hit those targets as we go. Did that make sense?
Yeah, and I guess maybe I should have thought and worded the question. So, you know, obviously there's a number of generators already fulfilling the obligation for the policy targets. And then we have contracted projects that, you know, in light of the decision from last week, may or may not go forward. And then we have the candidate category that, based on cost decisions within the model, it will elect to build to meet these criteria of 10 gigawatts behind the meter PV, which I actually don't think we are able to do that, or 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. And I guess my question is in light of last week's decision, should we revisit a little bit for the scenarios? I'm not saying for scenarios 2 and 3, perhaps revisit some of these categories.
In terms of, I think you're not talking about the definitions. You're talking about what we have as kind of base assumptions within those categories. And I think right now we don't have information about, you know, how the resources that are in these various categories may or may not have changed based on that decision yet. If we get more information as we go, I'm always a fan of best and newest information. So I think that's my kind of response there. Anybody else want to, you know?
Can I respond to that? I actually think you're raising a good point, and that could help inform what options we should consider under the other scenarios. And it would be helpful if we had the list of base generators and those that correspond to meeting the policy targets, the contracted generators, and what stage they are at, because like the base generators, so too the contractor generators are at different stages as well. And I think if I recall the petition, they kept it under development or something. It could be a broad category, not necessarily getting that into the ISO study process. And then the candidate category will be all the others. And the reason why I'm asking it could help inform a little bit some of the fine tuning of the scenarios if we understood what was in the or CGPP scenario 1.
No, that's a great point, and this I think is a good possibility if somebody wants to put something like that forward as an option in an email to us, you know, over the next couple of weeks. Your description makes total sense. You know, if somebody's interested in changing these definitions so we can have a different breakdown. The one thing I would mention is that, you know, regardless of how many of those projects move forward, the domestic expansion model is still going to need to choose, you know, similar quantities of renewable energy either way. But it would help us, you know, identify if anything's changing, you know, which resources may or may not drop out between now and then see, you know, how that changes related to the stage 1 modeling. I saw John Berniker raise his hand really quick. Is that related to this?
But can I just follow up one more thing? The location of where these systems are being placed really matters. And from that perspective is one of the things that I was contemplating more, not whether or not they ultimately would have a certain number of, you know, solar, whatever, but location is so important in this analysis.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
John, did you want to say something? I know there's other hands, but I think John might have been about to
Yeah,
respond
no,
to
I
that.
was just gonna jump in and add to what you were saying, Skylar. I think you hit the nail on the head. You know, at this point, we do not know what, if any, changes to the set of contracted projects specifically may result from last week's commission decision. And so as we get more information on what that looks like, we can consider if and how to take that into account for other scenarios. I just want to call it, highlight for folks' attention. There's a timing aspect to that that we can't necessarily control. So we're going to have to, at certain points, make a decision of when we are essentially locking down what that set of assumptions for these generator categories are for scenarios 2, 2, and 3. So that's really the only thing I wanted to add to the discussion that you and Aaron already had there, Skylar.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I think I saw Rodica and Raya raise their hands.
I can go. I think I was next in line. And it's related to this same question around contracted and candidate, because maybe the other part of it is why you get from New York ISO, which I suspect will be like you have to add X amount of solar and wind in different zones. And then there is the question of, out of those totals, how do you allocate them and at which nodes in the system, in the category of candidate? And would this be part, because to me those are interlinked, what you have the candidates, generic expansion, but then you also have to translate that with firm generators at specific locations. So would this methodology be discussed as part of stage 1 as well, or when would that be discussed? Because I think it matters, because going back to the point of contracted today versus what will remain contracted, I think is like if you have some criteria for inclusion for candidate generators, you may identify that even if a generator may not be contracted at that time, point in time, it might still be a candidate because it's advanced enough in the interconnection process, in the permitting process, to be your candidate generator.
That's a really good point, very good observation. We have a couple things that will hopefully help with that. So as we're transitioning from stage 1 to stage 2, we will have the input from the supply curve, for example. So what we're actually seeding the model with in stage 1 is the candidate generators from the supply curve assessment that NYSERDA was able to create with, I think it was PA Consulting. And that we were able to provide to the NYSO, and they were able to implement into their model on a county level basis, so that at the very least we'll know, even though they're represented on a zonal basis in stage 1, we'll know which resources were selected based on their cost and interconnection cost in the model, so that when we're moving from stage 1 to stage 2, we'll be able to tell, okay, which zone, which type of resource was actually chosen by the model. And then the only final step would be, if there is further decisions to be made, such as there being multiple utilities in a zone or multiple pieces of major infrastructure from a single utility in a zone, you have to decide where to put those resources. That stage 2 decision on siting methodology is still playing out. We're still trying to get to the bottom of that, whether it's placed on, we play God and we put it exactly where we think would be best, or if we allocate the generation based on a load share basis across the nodes, something like that. We still have to nail down those discussions, and it might be something that we have more discussions on with the JU here in the future. But it is very important, like you said.
Yes, and I think it's critical to the results as well, because where you will ultimately, as with DER, where you will be adding the generation that may drive the needs. And I do think there is a balance to make between putting them in ideal locations from a transmission standpoint versus putting them where development may be happening based on the queue or where research and community acceptance are more positive from a development standpoint. I think it would be helpful if there is some thinking towards in this area to maybe either have some sort of proposal methodology shared with us EPAC members, because I do think this is very important for the study
Yes,
results.
I think so too. I think this might be something, fortunately, that we have a little bit of time with, because the citing methodology would be a stage 2 item and not necessarily determining anything that we do here in the stage 1 assumptions. And I think that could give us some time to get the JU to provide that type of a proposal. And we'll see if we can get that in a timely fashion, so we could potentially send that around to stakeholders and the EPAC to get some review there. Right. I think there was one more hand, wasn't there?
Yes,
You know,
mine.
Right. Yes.
Raya Salters. Hi, thank you so much. So yeah, quick question. Can you clarify for me when you look at the candidate generators, can you clarify for me whether or not there will be any new or expanded fossil generation? Because I'm looking at it and I'm looking at the characteristics, including that include new and retrofit hydrogen combustion. So I want to be really clear, because I know I'm very familiar with the state scenario in terms of what that could potentially include for new and retrofit hydrogen, but also cognizant of the policy goals and the DEC's practice so far of not approving new fossil facilities as not compliant with the CLCPA.
Great point. No, that's a really good point. In the state scenarios, and this is one of the things that is likely going to stay very similar between all the scenarios, the possible generators, what those candidate generators actually are. And it was on stage 3 of this matrix where the types of generators we're going to seed the model with, we're actually going to allow the model to choose between for new energy that is needed. Is shown here in the second box, the land-based wind, utility PV, offshore wind, 4 and 8 hour battery storage, and then new or retrofitted hydrogen combustion. Well, sorry, new and retrofit hydrogen combustion is CGBP scenario 1. It's already in the model. It's likely to stay there in future scenarios, but that could be, a point of discussion if folks have interest in other candidate generators as well.
Well, I thank you. That's helpful, but just my question is really trying to, what will this model that's going forth now for scenario 1, what will the limits be to this new and retrofit hydrogen? And will it, frankly, I'm just trying to understand whether or not there will be any new or repowered or expanded fossil generation, included under the idea of new and retrofit hydrogen, or even pink hydrogen, and I know that, anyway, so I think just clarity there for me is really important, because it either is or it isn't, right? It's
sure. Yeah, well, let me try to answer it, and then if you would like additional clarification, I'm happy to take it offline, and we can go into more detail. So far, what we have is the ability for the model to build new hydrogen burning generation. That would not include, building a new fossil fuel power plant so that you can do it in the future. It would be a new hydrogen facility. And the other option is to retrofit an existing combustion facility to hydrogen. So the way the model is currently set up, there would not be any building of new fossil resources between now and 2040 so that they can eventually be switched to hydrogen. It's only developing new hydrogen resources or transitioning fossil resources to hydrogen.
all right. And yes, I'll ask again, but I'm just curious. So, but I would presume, since it was a state scenario, but that is limited to, that existing conversion is limited to what was in that scenario in the scoping plan. Like, we're not correct.
The conversion, the
The
conversion.
retrofit of, of existing would say be limited, the retrofit of existing, fossil generation to potential hydrogen would be limited to the parameters in the scoping plan. So it's not like we're going to be looking at, something, some experimental, some generator if it's now, being 100%.
Oh, yes,
That's
okay.
what I'm trying to get at, sorry.
Yes, no, it's going to be modeled in almost exactly the same way. I think it's this very similar, if not the exact same assumptions around the types of resources that actually exist. It's basically a thermal combustion turbine that's burning hydrogen using the parameters from previous studies.
Okay.
Right, and just to be clear about so this is Dave Kaup from NYSERDA. What parameters might mean. We're not telling Plexos or NISO that, if the number of, I'm going to call them thermal units in scenario 2 in the integration analysis was 18.4 gigawatts, that they need to build 18.4 gigawatts or retrofit 18.4 gigawatts. We're not constraining or telling the model the amount of any of that kind of resource.
Well, I remember it being as a percentage, like it was at least in the integration analyses, it was, presented at, at a percentage. So there would be an upward limit, yes?
When you say upward limit, you mean of the megawatt capacity, nameplate capacity, or what parameter are you talking about?
I think maybe that's exactly what I'm, that's exactly what I'm asking you is, we know that there is a limited potential for some of these hydrogen projects, and we know that folks want to propose a lot more. And, but that we had landed in the integration analysis in the integration analysis, at least as presented to me, and I could go back to try and get it more of it, there's a representation of that limited percentage. And so I heard you clarifying that you're not sort of giving NISO a specific, megawatt amount, and that makes sense, but that I'm guessing that they are going to be trying to model in the proportion anyway that the integration analysis provided, as opposed to sort of moving that up and down the scale.
I think we're saying, please make this type of resource available to be selected if it should be selected. And we are not stipulating how much should be selected or not selected. It's just being made available.
Yeah, we're not presetting, how much of the current fossil fleet has to or can be switched to hydrogen. I think there might be some constraints over, which existing resources can even do that, but I think that would be the farthest we're going. I think we would allow retrofits of feasible resources up to whatever level the model says is necessary.
Okay, and I guess that's and I don't want to hold the floor too long, but just that, I guess that is like whatever is necessary. There's an upward bound. You get me, around the same page. There's an upward bound to the scenario. That was the whole point. The discussion that we had between the scenarios was how much would be for for hydrogen. How much. So it's not. There's an upward bound. But I'm hearing you say that NISO will have and there's certainly an upward bound in terms of technology, but I'm just trying to say, what will scenario 1 be modeling?
So scenario 1 has a load forecast, and you need to be able to meet reliably that energy need in every hour of the year. It's getting the option to choose, wind, solar, offshore wind, and, battery storage.
No,
and
I understand what it'll be modeling, but what will it be? What will it be modeling? Will it be modeling these hydrogen resources pursuant to the recommendation of the scoping plan?
I don't think I'm clear on what recommendation you're talking about, but I think we do probably need to take it at this point.
Scenario 2.
So scenario 2,
which was my understanding was it was scenario 2, right? That was the basis for NYSERDA's NYSERDA's analysis here.
Right, but we were only setting parameters of, a load forecast that was established, but then we were not saying to NISO, you need to build the exact same build mix that the integration analysis built for scenario 2 using your Plexos model. We're letting Plexos run, and we'll see what build mix it selects between all the resources that Skylar was just mentioning a minute ago. And among the many that it has to choose from is, I don't know what terminology I should be using, but thermal units on clean, hydrogen.
All right, so I guess that's we can take it offline and talk about it more, but it sounds then is that what folks need to know is what that criteria will be. How it will be, what will the criteria be for that selection?
It's picking whatever it needs to pick to hit the state targets, and that meets locational requirements, the IRM, transfer limits, whatever the pipe and bubble representation can say of the economic dispatch and and use of the system.
Yeah, but understood that so I guess what I'm trying to say, there should be some type of clarification that you're saying whatever it needs, but we know, that the technology is not there, for say 100%, and 100% generator. Like, do you see what I'm saying? So it does seem that it's important what the criteria will be for how much it will allow, given that that was the whole meaning for the integration analysis.
Yeah,
Maybe we're talking past each other, but
I think so.
I'm hearing
I think
you
so.
say
Let's
that
just,
there's no upward bound to how much hydrogen this scenario will look at.
yeah, let's take this offline. I think having a separate conversation about what we're talking about would be helpful, because I think I'm still turned around, and we've already spent about 10 minutes on this topic, and we have about 30 minutes before I wanted to jump to next steps and moving us towards the next EPAC meeting, and we've
Okay.
only gotten through the first
I do
the first tab on this, and I think there's a few of these that are going to be easy as we move through the matrix, but please still ask for clarifications as you need them. The next section of the matrix is basically on the model framework. This is not necessarily the inputs in terms of the renewable resources necessarily, but these are the other aspects of building a model for the constraints we're putting into the capacity expansion model. For example, the study years we're actually looking at. We're looking at a 20-year time frame from 2023 to 2042, inclusive of 2042. But the results will be reported in 5-year increments to make sure that we can hit that the 2030 year, 2035 year, and 2040 year, which are very important years in terms of our policy goals, to make sure that we can still manage that information and we get that detailed information for those years. I'm hoping there's no questions on that, so I'm just going to jump to the next one. For the time representation in the model, this is not something we're going to be able to change either, because this is basically built into the NISO's representation of the Plexos modeling. But for each model year, just for people's reference, there's a number of representative days that are identified that match the load for a statistically significant portion of the year. And then that number of representative days are aligned and merged together to create a full year that matches the peak and generation of the load profile we've seeded the model with. And the reason we do this is to simplify the decision making in the model a little bit. If we gave it 365 completely different days for every zone, that's a lot of extra data points and computing power that doesn't necessarily give you much more value over, say, using the 20 or 30 representative days, because there might be 20 or 30 days in March that are almost exactly the same, and then a bunch of summer days that are exactly the same. So merging those and be able to put them together simplifies the modeling a lot, and also allows us to still preserve the chronology so we can do state of charge dispatch for things like energy storage, which is a very important output that we're looking for. So that's just kind of the inner workings of this model. Aaron?
Just quick question, Skylar. You've used the term "we" in this instance, and I want to confirm whatever methodology is used here for our state scenario, it's consistent with how the NISO is doing it for their other two scenarios.
Yes, I believe so. Chi, do you want to say anything there? I'm pretty sure this is just copy pasted from the NISO's work, and we haven't really given any input to that. This is just something that's built into their modeling.
For the transmission, I believe that is what we're having.
Right. Yeah. It should be the same across all models. We haven't changed that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. On this transmission section, there's a couple of different things in this table right here. The first aspect is just, in the blue, you'll see which transmission is being added to the model. That is basically, it's not currently operational in New York State at the moment, but it's planned and will be coming online during the modeling timeframe. So this was the scenario 1 build out of transmission, where we went into the Plexos. This is the NISO is adding the NYPA North Country project, the Champlain Hudson Power Express, Clean Path New York, the phase 1 and phase 2 projects approved through the utilities through those orders, and the Long Island Offshore Wind Public Policy Project will be added into the transmission representation of the model in the scenario 1. If folks want to propose changes to this representation, that's something you can follow up with us on after and kind of throw that into the ring as an option. Not necessarily hard coding any of these at the moment. I think the blue ones are mostly hard coded, but we're open to discussion. The things that are a little bit more complicated is in the black text here. The nodal to zonal reduction of the transmission network performed by Plexos is pretty complicated, but that's basically how the NISO has gotten to a zonal representation of the New York State electricity system. But then when you go in the other direction, and this goes back to a question we had earlier, when you go to the other direction in stage 2, we'll have to disaggregate that again back into a nodal representation of where those generation resources are placed and where the transmission is interconnecting. There's just one more aspect that was kind of a recent addition here that came directly out of the order, where we're hoping to have some representation of subzonal transmission constraints modeled in the Plexos original modeling, so that we can estimate how much headroom actually exists within a zone while we're doing the capacity expansion build out. We didn't really want to wait until after stage 1 to place those constraints in, because we felt that would lead to too much time lost through iteration of the capacity expansion model. For example, building 10,000 megawatts of wind in zone B, only to find out in stage 2 that there was only like 1,000 megawatts of headroom or something for renewable energy to interconnect. So we wanted to represent both the headroom actually available within a zone, and those estimates are being developed right now through the JU headroom analysis, but also coming up with a conceptual marginal upgrade cost for actually going past that headroom available. So just to provide an example, if we end up getting something like a headroom number that says you can put 2,000 megawatts of resources into zone A, the model might see that it wants to put a lot in zone A based on the cost. It might fill that 2,000, fill that headroom, all 2,000 megawatts built, and now there's 0 headroom left in zone A. And now the model has to choose between building a generation resource elsewhere or paying this marginal upgrade cost in zone A on top of the generation capital cost. So we didn't want to have the headroom be a fixed limit, but we also didn't want to not represent it. So that was in the original CGPP order, and the JU are developing this information as we speak, and that'll be put into the model imminently. I think that the lockdown date was today in the NISO's process. I think I saw a couple hands raise while I was speaking just then, but I did not see who raised first. Sorry.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Xiaojian. I think I'm asking a simple clarification questions. Xiaojian from New York Power Authority. So I just want to ask, for joint utilities phase 2 projects, are those the ones already got approved, like a phase 2A project for area of concerns? There's also some projects filed by joint utilities and not approved yet. So I just want to clarification here means the already approved ones or everyone.
Just the approved ones will be firm in the model at the moment. Yep.
Okay, yeah, then it's possible maybe just adding like a approved, in here, a note here.
Okay, thank you.
So, Skylar, this is Erin. I don't know if it was anybody else, but I had my hand up as well. And I just want to walk through to make sure I understand this. And it seems like this is a really important value that is being added to the capacity expansion. So if I understand our presentation from the last meeting, we have the supply curve of the actual resources. In addition to that, what I hear you saying is that the utilities are going to come up with subzonal headroom constraints. And I'm just thinking through how the model goes through the assessment. They have the supply curve, and that goes to fulfill the maximum amount, and then the headroom could be the limiting factor. Is that how the model is going to be making the decision-making process?
I think so. Based on the way you said it, I think that's correct. You know, the supply curve has the amount of available resources in a given area, and we're seeding the model with county level information, so we have pretty granular details there. But the model can see on a zonal basis how much energy is needed, how much resources are available to build. But they're also going to have this partially limiting constraint, not a full limiting constraint, of the headroom for that zone. A good example that we usually use is something like Zone E, which is a zone that basically touches Canada and Pennsylvania. You could have 30 or 40,000 megawatts of resource potential in that zone, but you might only have 5,000 or 6,000 megawatts of potential interconnections or transmission availability. So we wanted to make sure that headroom limit was on there, but it's not a, like I said, it's not a fully limiting factor because there is the ability to build more. And so we're going to have a conceptual marginal upgrade cost to go beyond that currently initially limiting factor of headroom. So you can build beyond that if it's economical.
Okay, yeah, this sounds like a great development. I guess that marginal cost and what that marginal cost is going to be critical. And
Very
you could,
important.
yeah, and you could envision that marginal cost would be, to play with it a little bit for sensitivity would be appropriate. So that's great news. What a great improvement. Thank you.
That's a good call out. Thank you. I think I saw Rodica too.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I was actually seconding Erin's comments that are partially what I had in mind as well. It might be very beneficial to see a sensitivity without those subzonal constraints to have like the bookends, because this seems to me like very critical. Whatever that initial value is and that marginal upgrade cost would determine, kind of like it shapes out the portfolio to begin with. So your example with Southern Tier, there are a lot of potential renewable development, for instance, but if that headroom is small and the marginal upgrade cost is higher, and then the question is like, how is that defined? Is it consistent? Is it a consistent methodology across all zones? Is it based on rebuilding a local line? How is that defined? But like that area, for instance, could be a good area for bulk upgrades, and you get a lot of renewables. So a lot could be more beneficial at the end than upgrading, lines across, multiple areas. So you see what I mean? It's like it could
Yep, this is,
show
yeah,
that, but it also can show like the benefit of doing something bigger in one area that could unlock a lot more renewables. So to me, those values are very critical, in fact, and it would be good to compare with without limits, and then also have in mind what we see now compared to what the end portfolio will be, because to me, this almost defines what that end portfolio will be.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for that. That's definitely something that if you're really interested in that, and it sounds like a couple folks are, throw that in to your email of like possible assumptions that you think are really important to test, and whether it's a scenario or sensitivity, that's definitely something we should bring up at the 30th, the meeting on the 30th. Chi?
Tyler, I was just, maybe we can offer a little bit of assistance in understanding capacity expansion. I think there has been questions throughout what exactly is capacity expansion, what are some of the major variables that could impact the results. So that by itself, capacity expansion is very complicated. And Skylar, you've done a phenomenal job explaining what it is. But if folks are interested, NYSO study System Resource Outlook, when we published last year, there's an appendix E.3. There is a detailed description on the capacity expansion, the modeling, and the methodology. Again, it's appendix E.3. And also, if you go through NYSO presentation, we did a primer on educating our stakeholders. So if you're interested, those are materials out there. Thanks.
That was great. Thank you. Sounds like a candidate for another thing to add to our website, or at least the links. Thank you. Okay, so we are kind of running short on time here, so I'm going to start moving a little bit quicker through here, and then kind of hope we can save about 5 or 10 minutes at the end to go through what we're hoping to get from you all over the next couple of weeks. If in the case that we don't get all the way through this, or if we get through it quickly, which would be my preference, get through it quickly, but don't get to every question, happy to follow up one-on-one through email or a quick call or something to clarify anything, so we can get the best understanding for each and every one of you, so that you have the best available input for how to help us develop scenario 2 and 3. So I'm just going to move pretty quickly through these next ones. The data inputs in forecasting now. So these are some of the ones that we've presented before, trying to just generally stay close to the integration analysis, so that it's very close to some of the other state modeling we've done, so we have a reference point. But for the energy forecast and peak load, we have developed a hourly load shape for each model year. This is something I can't remember if we've sent it out already, but we do have this. It's been provided in NYSO. It's something that we hope to post on the website, and just so you guys can look at that. And the specific numbers that make up that forecast include the demand and peaks based on scenario 2 from the integration analysis. That there's a few things we had to do to that forecast to make sure it could be picked up and dropped into the Plexos version of the modeling that the NYSO has developed. And the main changes that have had to be made so far are the removal of the flexible loads from the forecast itself, and the removal of electrolysis, because those are things that are going to be explicitly modeled by Plexos. So that's I think a positive development, being able to endogenously model those types of things. We go through some of these things that are basically the same assumptions that were already presented by Nick from NYSERDA. We have a whole presentation and recording on this online already. So if you have questions about energy forecast and peak load that was in scenario 1, you could go reference that. And if you have ideas for how we would change this or alternatives, that's something that you could definitely jot down and then submit to us over the next couple weeks as something that you're really interested in testing out as part of a future scenario. These next two, the emissions price forecast and the fuel price forecast, these are both taken directly from the NYSO's modeling frameworks. We have not changed these at all. I expect that at least one or two of these, maybe the emissions price forecast, will probably stay the same throughout the rest. But fuel price forecasts are often something that could be made into a scenario or a sensitivity just based on the variability in those resources. It's often nice to test those things. So if folks are interested in analyzing, this detail for what the fuel price forecast was and where we might go with it if we want to test something else, please, provide that feedback as well via email. Chris. Chris Wendlandt, sorry. Well, we can't hear you. You might be on mute.
Sorry about that. You mentioned RGGI, and RGGI is currently under a program review. So are you utilizing kind of current program components of RGGI? And then the second question on the CO2 is that the state's currently in the process of looking at the cap and invest, but since it is not at an endpoint, I'm assuming that's not in any of the modeling.
Yep, you're 2 for 2 on that one. Yeah,
Okay.
we're using best current information on RGGI, and there's no additional layer of the cap and invest.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. In terms of other modeling constraints that are put on either the use of generation resources or the amount of things that the model has to build, there's a couple of big ones. So I'm going to start with this second one first, the policy targets. I think this one is less controversial. We have policy targets. I think most of these are in law. And so these are going to be fixed in the model in scenario 1, the behind the meter PV constraints, in addition to the renewable energy constraints and the specific resource build outs will be fixed. The one that is not in law that I see here is the 6 gigawatts of energy storage. This is the roadmap was published at the end of last year, and so awaiting commission action. This was a governor's announcement, and at the moment it's 3 gigawatts is in state law, but I'll also note that all previous modeling has gone far beyond 6 by 2040. So that's something to keep in mind when we look at those targets. Now jumping back up to the slightly more detailed and controversial ones, the capacity reserve margin and the UCAP. These are related concepts, so we put them together here. For the capacity reserve margin, which is basically the amount of additional energy resources, the additional capacity that has to be built to make sure that even under statistical outage scenarios, there will not be more outages than allowable in the model, which is a 1 day in 10 year constraint for the number of outages that is allowed. We've done previous modeling from the integration analysis showing in the deep decarbonization situations how the capacity reserve margin expands as you go when you have the higher load profile as well as more intermittent resources. The amount of capacity you actually have to have on the system to maintain reliability increases. And so we've taken that information from the integration analysis modeling and seeded the NYSO's Plexos modeling with that information. I'm not going to probably answer many questions on this here, but just throwing numbers out there that we hope to post soon. What we've seen is that in the modeling, the capacity reserve margin expands from somewhere around 10 to 11% at the moment to somewhere around 17 or 18% by 2050. So it's not a huge change, but it does expand a bit, and we wanted to represent that in the model. In terms of the generator UCAP, this is the actual deliverable capacity during any given hour. The firm capacity for the base generators is just taken from the NYSO's 2022 RNA base case. That's a very good source for that information. For the additional contracted and candidate renewable resources, the firm capacity contribution is based on the ELCC curve modeling. I'm not sure if we've presented that here, but there's data tables in the integration analysis, as well as some updated tables that have been coming out recently. showing that the expected load carrying capability, the ELCC, of these various resources does change both over time and as you change the resource mix. So solar might have one ELCC with no storage on the system, but the ELCC may improve if there's solar on the system. So that's a very dynamic UCAP situation here when we're talking about renewable resources and storage. So we thought that was really important to make sure we had that type of a representation in the model itself. So we're taking those UCAP ratings from the integration analysis and putting those into the NISOS model. And I'd encourage you to look at that and reach out if you have any questions. I think we went over this last time, the maximum resource potential. Candidate generators are the ones that we're talking about here, things that the model will have to choose from. The location and availability is going to be drawn from the supply curve analysis undertaken by NYSERDA. And the total resource potential has been built up like we showed last time, from a GIS analysis to resiting, land availability, generation up potential, and then the total megawatt potential is fed into the model by a county level. The model will spit out zonal results, but we'll be able to backtrack and see which county level resources were chosen. Going now to the actual generators and generator properties, which we've had some amount of discussion on. Oh, I just saw a hand. Was that about something previous? Yeah, it's Rodica. Sorry, did you have a question, or should I move on? Okay, I can't hear you if you're speaking, so I'm just going to move on and maybe throw something in the chat here, and we'll try to get to it at the end. We're using the base resources from the NISO's system resource outlook base case in the that's being seeded in their production cost modeling. It's basically just the generators you would find in the gold book. And then on top of that, the candidate generators are from this list here. And just please reach out if you have any other questions on that. And I'm sure we'll follow up with Raya on the hydrogen part later. Retirements, this is another thing that's typically open for a lot of scenario interest and sensitivity interest. We have some known retirements for the base generators. We're taking the known retirements just from the NISO's data and layering on a few other things like firm retirement for the NYPA small gas plants in 2030. And then there's some typically simulation of these optional retirement decisions for various resources based on age, economics and all those types of things. But for most of the resources in the capacity expansion model this time, we're going to be taking from the the assumptions developed during the integration analysis and kind of modifying them slightly for the Plexos modeling, where we will have age-based retirements for existing units. And that age-based threshold is 60 years. But an important consideration when you're actually doing the modeling is, given that we do have a number of resources in New York State that are already past 60 years, we don't want to turn the model on and have everything drop out before we've lived a day in the capacity expansion model. So we're working with the NISO to develop this phase-in approach so that there might be maybe a 5 or a 10-year period over which the total number of, to be retired generators based on that age-based retirement can be phased in and not lead to, unrealistic results. But that's definitely something that, I was expecting, feedback on, questions, and maybe tests in future sensitivities and scenarios as well. I think I saw a hand previously come up.
This is Radha Surya. Hi, Skylar. I have a question here. This is Radha Surya from Invenergy representing IPNI. I think I do have two questions, one on the generator, one on the retirements. Let me start with the generators. How is the DISO queue taken into account while you're modeling this generation? And while I'm asking that question, I understand that in capacity expansion, you're equalizing it to the higher kV network, right? You put a generator like 1,000 or 2,000 megawatt on the higher KB network, but not the detail. Are you considering what is in the queue to at least model what kind of generation you would have in a given zone?
Yes, we're definitely going to be referencing actual queue positions so that when we're placing resources, we have a better sense of like if there's resources already lined up in that zone. That can give us some information about interconnection points. I'm not exactly sure, specifically at what stage we're going to be using that because it could be used in a number of different stages, both in placing resources here and modeling them in stage 2. But I know we will be referencing the queue positions. The queue is also relevant for the deactivations as well as resources that may be at a sufficiently advanced stage to meet the inclusion principles to be a base generator. So that's another way we're kind of double checking queue to gold book to other available information.
That sounds great. Thanks for clarifying that. I think probably hydrogen is a different topic. We might circle back later with the discussion already happened. But on the retirements, you were mentioning about the 60 years and over generation to be taken out, right? You mentioned about a phased approach. How do you envision implementing this? How do you prioritize which generation would go away first and which would stay in the model? Because you don't want to have extra generation down the load, right? That's the big problem with the balance with a lot of generation coming in offshore and onshore and everything.
Yeah.
How are you going to balance that load versus generation?
No, that's a great point. We have a lot of things to think about here because this could be a very loaded methodological question. What we're trying to do is kind of split the middle here and just go with the age based, but with this phase in, it looks like we might be able to do something where we phase down not literal individual units, but potentially fractional units as we go. So we can kind of phase that out and make sure we don't have a dramatic overbuilding of capacity. We don't over retire and have no additional capacity in certain zones. So we're trying to thread the needle and make sure we're doing something that's reasonable and realistic, where that represents super old generation reaching its end of life. But the model obviously also has the ability to choose whether to retrofit to hydrogen at certain stages too. So depending on the age, if it's like 57 years old, 3 years from now, it might have a decision to make. So those types of things. So it's very complicated and it's being implemented in the model now, and we'll bring that back if there's any major updates.
Thanks, Skylar. I would love to hear some detail about that implementation in the future EPAC meetings so that we can weigh in. Thank you.
Absolutely.
And hi, Skylar. This is Shajan from NIPA. We agree with the NIPA small clean plans on the assumption in the state scenario. Just also we want to mention that there's exceptions, right? If there's if they are find out to be necessary to the system reliability and other exceptions, these units will not be retired. So we want to, think about the potential sensitivities for our scenarios 2 and 3, for the team to discuss.
Thank you. Thanks for that input. Okay, so I think we just have a few more. We're doing really good. Hopefully, we'll have a couple more minutes at the end to go over what we want to do in the next couple of weeks. For generator heat rates, this is just going into how the model sees the generator using fuel to create the energy. For base generators, we're using the NISO data from their other cases and their production cost modeling. For contracted and candidate resources, we're using the EIA Energy Outlook. There really isn't much to say about that from the renewable perspective, except for the hydrogen units, which will be using the thermal operating characteristics data from the integration analysis Annex 1. So if you have some interest in that, you can go ahead and check that out. We have the link to it in this document. For capital cost, we really only need to apply this to the candidate generators because everything else is either built and already paid for in the model. as a firm build. The capital cost that we're using is going to be based on the supply curve analysis, and that's going to include. I think the model will be representing the capital cost as the upfront cost to purchase that, which is going to include any of the additional costs for interconnection based on the distance to interconnection points, like Mac was showing us in the presentation last time. And there will be additional costs layered on, for example, if we are already at a headroom in a current zone and we need to pay additional costs to increase the headroom before building a resource. Those are the type of costs that would be layered on during this capital cost decision making as well. For these next two, most of this is really straightforward. You know, there's fixed O&M costs for most resources. We have fixed O&M from the NISO's data and their documentation, which typically from the EPA, that those types of resources are already built in, except for, once again, hydrogen, where we're taking the resource costs, FO&M from hydrogen from the integration analysis. And it's the same thing with the variable O&M. The base case generators are coming from the NISO. The VO&M cost, this should be updated here in a second. We just got clarification that while this is the correct source, the variable O&M cost listed for the renewable and battery storage resources is actually 0. So this can probably be deleted at this point because there was a clarification that those resources O&M is built exclusively into fixed O&M, including I just lost the word as halfway through the sentence. Augmentation of energy storage is built into the fixed O&M in the modeling framework. So this second part can be deleted, and then the VO&M cost for hydrogen is also coming from the integration analysis. Okay, I just want to say one more thing on the matrix about the external area properties. This is something that's going to be filled in and is being filled in as we speak by the NISO. They're figuring out how to incorporate those external areas, both from a electrical system perspective, but also from a policy build out and energy forecast, you know, all those good things that built our entire scenario one. They have to be made on a simplified basis for how to represent the external areas. And just for reference, I think we have 4 external areas that we really have to model: ISO New England, Hydro-Quebec, Ontario, and PJM territory. But those external areas might have more than one interconnection through zones in the actual model. So we're figuring out right now how the NISO is going to be able to incorporate those things, and we'll have more updates on this, which will likely be very similar throughout most models. Although there's a couple of wrinkles that could be thrown in here if folks are interested in future meetings talking through how the external areas will be modeled in the capacity expansion model. So with that, I think we have maybe 2 minutes for questions. Then I wanted to jump into next steps. Did we get Rodica back on the line?
Can you hear me?
Hey, yes, I can.
Yeah, I don't know why I keep getting muted back after I am mute. Sorry about that. I guess my question was related to the renewable supply curve. You were mentioning that the model has the information from that PA study on what the supply curve is by site, by county or zone, but then you will overlay the headroom capacities, not the headroom values. So will be in the capacity expansion modeling, so it'll be helpful to see the two, and is headroom defined as well by county to have that apple to apple same application of both headroom and supply curve in an area. So I think it would be helpful to discuss that consistency between those two definitions.
You have really, really good questions. No, that's another really good point. The current idea right now is that there's going to be headroom. The utilities obviously have it as granular as you want it, basically. But for the headroom that's going to be fed into the model, they're aggregating it by themselves on a utility territory by zone. And in zones where there's multiple utility territories, the utilities are working together to make sure they can come to one number. So the capacity expansion model is going to have a zonal number, and the capacity expansion model will be choosing zonal resources, but we know they are on a county level. So we have basically all the information we need. We have granular supply curve information, and we have granular headroom information, but the model is still just zonal. The key point, like you said before, is really going to be that handoff, stage 1 to stage 2, when we can disaggregate the headroom, disaggregate the supply curve, and make sure we're placing things where it makes sense, and where the headroom actually was inside that zone. So we're not artificially inflating costs or artificially avoiding certain resources.
Yeah, and that's my biggest concern with this is, are we deciding already the needs and the solutions? Although I do understand the valid point of, you don't want to kind of like overshoot by assuming a bunch of renewables in a zone that cannot feasibly integrate those. But at the same time, we may go on the other extreme of eliminating certain zones because of those limitations that we have as an input. So again, like sensitivities and some sort of bookends. And I think Yachi also said that we'll have the information from New York ISO on the constraint pockets. And to me, that's an opportunity to see, like, can we have bulk solutions in those pockets? Because you may be able to unlock a lot of renewables with, a bulk investment versus going in multiple zones, and may not be as effective from a transmission cost at the end.
That's a good point. Yeah, I think there is something that can help. That is the fact that the model will have the ability to choose to increase headroom as part of the capacity expansion. So we might not lose it entirely, but I get your point that we will have to kind of really think really hard and focus really hard on how that is being broken up to make sure we're not influencing the results ineffectively somehow. But we'll definitely keep an eye on that. We did have one more question, then I have to jump to next steps. I think it was Mike.
Hi, yeah, it's Mike Spector from Grid United. And I just had a question on the last section, external area properties.
Pass. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
It says TBD. Does that mean in these next two cases they may be looked at, or?
Yeah, sorry. This is something that we have very little control over. There's some amount of influence that we might be able to have in terms of how we decide we want to incorporate, external areas policy build outs. But what this mostly was put on here for is just to let you all know that the NYISO actually this time, I don't think it was done last time, but this time in the State System Resource Outlook, they're actually incorporating external areas into the modeling to get a more accurate representation of those power flows and imports and exports. And they're going to be building out, external region energy forecasts, the specific, I think maybe one node, maybe a couple more, but I think one node per external areas, and how the generation is built out there, in addition to trying to have some simplified transmission representative of our connections there. So this is all information that we're basically going to be getting from the NYISO, and I think they have a couple of presentations saying, proposals for these things, but it's still not determined yet.
Is there a name for that study? I might have missed it.
It's their the System and Resource Outlook presentations as part of their ESPWG working group.
Okay.
Yeah, they have a couple of presentations that are going through how they might do this. Yep.
Okay,
This is
great.
Yachi Lin from NYISO, and just want to confirm, Skylar, you're 2 for 2.
Woo!
You get, yes, Mike, this is NYISO System and Resource Outlook. So we do look at, you'll hear people talk about like the generation pockets, external area, like these we coordinate with our neighboring ISO RTOs to come up with a better representation. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Really glad she was here. Well, that leaves us about 6 minutes, which I think is just enough time. to say, thank you to everybody for showing up. I know we just keep asking you to show up so we can just dump ridiculous amounts of information on you in a very short amount of time. But this was kind of a really important piece, I thought, to build this foundation of what builds these scenarios and make sure everyone's comfortable with what was done in scenario 1. So you can kind of highlight in your own heads, where do we think we have some, some wiggle room here? Where can we tweak a couple of these assumptions to make a completely different scenario that could test something new to give the commission some very important information about alternative futures that might not look exactly like this future that was developed under scenario 1. And so I'm sure a lot of things popped into a lot of people's heads during this presentation. And I know there's probably a lot of questions that weren't asked today. So there's 2 things I'd like from you all over the next couple of weeks. One is please reach out if you have questions. I want to make sure everyone has a good understanding of all this stuff before we move into starting on the 30th and every 2 weeks after that, getting into the nitty-gritty of developing new assumptions. First one, just reach out with questions. The second piece is whatever flags were raised in your heads as we were going through this matrix today of assumptions we made in CGPP scenario 1 that you were like, oh man, I don't think that's going to happen, or that would be really cool to test something else. If you had something like that, please write it down and say, this is an assumption that I think was important to change. If you take it one step further and you say, oh, there's this group of assumptions that I think is related, that I think is really important to change and build a completely different scenario on. If you have that concept for what I'm going to call, just so we're all in the same vocabulary over the next 2 or 3 meetings, we're going to call them themes. Basically, each scenario we want to have our own theme for, so we know how the scenarios work together to give the commission the right amount of information. So if you have a theme for a scenario where like this is something I think is really important theme, but you don't know exactly which assumptions should probably be tweaked to make that theme tested, write that down as well. We don't necessarily need you all to email us like a completed matrix of a new scenario that you've created. That would be too much. I mean, you can do that, but that would probably be too much to ask. And it might not even be as helpful for actually building the discussions in the future meetings. So what I would ask is, obviously reach out with any questions and then take note of those themes that you're interested in testing, assumptions you think should be changed to build a different scenario, and email them to the EPAC email address so that we can aggregate those. And hopefully if we have time, before that meeting on the 30th, we'll be able to kind of put those all together and walk through those, possible themes that can be scenarios 2 and 3. I also want to maybe highlight in an email after this, sometime this week, I'll probably be sending out another email just listing some of these assumptions that are unlikely to change. I pointed out a few of them, like a lot of the data that we're just taking from base case generators from the NISO, not going to change. The timeline, going to 2042, it's not going to change. So like a lot of these things are not going to change. So you can focus your effort on, which ones should change, how should they change, those types of things. You don't need to come up with a new data set. If you say, I want to change the load forecast, you don't have to make the new load forecast. We'll figure that out as we go. But just come up with those, and I'll give bonus points to anybody who comes up with clever names for their scenarios as well. We want to have some good marketing here under CGPP. So anyone who comes up with a good name for what scenarios 2 and 3 should be, something better than state scenario would be great. Want to keep it fun and hopefully move into the October 30th meeting with a group of proposals that we can kind of talk through and try to focus our attention on as we move through the next 3 or 4 meetings through December. So with that, were there any final questions in the last minute? Okay, Aaron.
During the course of these meetings we've had, I think we've had about 3, we haven't heard a whole lot from the transmission owners. So to the extent they have thoughts that they want to educate us, give us some of their feedback, that could help make decisions going forward. So I just hope, you know, they're going to be offering some suggestions as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yep, they're all on the EPAC.
Yep.
They're yeah, they're here.
All right, thank you.
Awesome. So with that, we are right on time at 4 o'clock. I will let you all go to your 4 o'clock meetings and have a great week. And as usual, reach out by email to either myself or the EPAC mail address, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Have a good day all.
Thank you.